Afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick. I'm the Communications Officer at the New Trust, and today we're talking about Stalking Awareness Week, and we're going to talk about what actually stalking is. And today with me we've got Kayte and Stephanie. Kayte, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Kate. I work for the U Trust as a DV, domestic violence car worker.
And what exactly is a domestic violence car worker?
I go out to domestic violence incidents with the police and support the victim.
Hi, I'm Steph Churchill. I'm a domestic violence and abuse health advocate based in Hampshire. I work out of a hospital and support victims who come through the hospital. So we receive health referrals and we train staff in the NHS to increase awareness of domestic abuse, part of which is stalking.
Of course, yes. And that is today's topic. So what is stalking?
So it comes in many different forms, but ultimately it's a type of harassment. And I think the kind of harassment it is obsessive, unwanted and fixated behaviour from a perpetrator towards a victim.
And what do you think, Kate? What in your mind is similar ideas there?
I would say, it's persistent, unwanted attention. And in this day and age with social media, I think, because we all think of stalking as something where a man is following a woman down the street and looking in a window, but I think cyber stalking is huge. I think it can happen at any age. It can happen to children at school. It happens to grown-ups. It happens with people you work with. It's, I think it's since the introduction of the internet, I think it's a far greater problem now than it has been previously.
So quite right. I think I read some figures somewhere that said during COVID, online stalking obviously went up massively because people weren't allowed to go out. People were using that as the only sort of means to keep an eye on a tab on people. So what makes stalking an actual crime?
I think it's when it makes the victim feel fearful. I think it's, and that's a crime. You're not allowed to deliberately frighten and threaten people, and of course that's absolutely right, and it should be a crime, and it is a crime. It's some of the behaviours stalkers show are incredibly nuanced. I think it can be very hard to spot, especially in the early stages. I think it can be very hard to prove in a lot of the times until it becomes extreme. But we all know many examples of how far it can go. So I think for me, it becomes an offence when the victim, the person of the stalking, whatever the intention of them is, it becomes a crime when that person feels threatened, frightened, scared, and they change their behaviours in order to try and avoid what is happening to him, that they're frightened and they're changing their life and what they normally do in order to feel safer because of this harassment.
That's completely right, because, you could phone somebody and, you could get a silent phone call. And if that makes the victim afraid, that in itself is a form of assault. So it is a crime. All of these types of stalking are a crime. There's a really famous case. A young woman called Alice Ruggles was killed by her stalker in 2016. It was her ex-partner. 2 weeks before he killed her, he left flowers and chocolates outside her bedroom window. And when you go to report something like that, he's left flowers and chocolates outside my window, you probably feel a bit silly, like, the police response might be, all right, it doesn't sound that bad. But what you have to focus on is the motive behind it and, to get some history about, well, what's his behaviour been like before that? That's really important, I think, that motivation, because those flowers and chocolates were a big indicator of, his mindset at that time and where that was going.
So, of course, you're talking about the impact of stalking, of course, on victims. And is there an almost generic impact on people? I mean, you mentioned, Kate, feeling fearful, for example. What are the other sort of ramifications of stalking?
Well, I think, like, Steph said, it depends as well on the person who's receiving this behaviour. Because after this had happened to Alice, one of her calls to the police about the chocolates and flowers was released to the public. We could hear it. And she sounded so unsure, and she felt so nervous about saying, someone's left me chocolates and flowers, and you could hear in her voice she was saying, I know it's a bit silly, but someone's left me, but there's a history, and he's been. And I think because she absolutely knew the severity of it, but she felt so frightened and silly about it that she didn't really go for it with the police. And the police, I mean, messed up. There's no question about that, and they've issued apologies and changes as a result. But I think what makes it, for each different person, it's different. If somebody else might phone up and say, I'm so frightened, I know that he's going to kill me, come round now. Do you know? And I think the responses you get are different depending on how you are and who you are and how you say it sometimes, and how frightened you are. And I mean, there are three, I think, different elements to stalking. It's, you can be followed, you can contact or attempt to contact, or you can monitor a person's use of the internet. So we've had examples of people even using the Wi-Fi password to see what someone was watching at home when they're out the house, because they still know the passwords, all that kind of thing. So if you know that's happening, I think at that point, how it makes you feel, what it does to you inside, you can have you're terrified, you can have your behaviours changed. It can lead to depression, anxiety, insomnia. It can, I mean, your mental health. We all know that anxiety is a horrible thing at the best of times, but adding something that is pointed on you continually, and who you are as a person and how you respond to that. Like in Alice's case, she felt silly.
She knew it was dangerous, but also she had an element of self-doubt, I think. Because I think most people would in that kind of situation. You'd think, am I making too much of nothing? Maybe some people had made her feel like she was making too much of nothing. And that's why having an awareness of the dangers of stalking is so important, and why, we need to spread the message.
Do you think people are more aware now about what isn't okay? Or do you think it's now so confusing because of social media, for example?
Yeah, I do. I think it's really confusing. And I think, like we were saying, it depends who you are. And I think the ages that you are play a big part in it. I think education could be really helpful about stalking, in early prevention around this, like role education. I think it plays quite a crucial part in preventing stalking. I mean,
as soon as a child gets a phone, that's when we need to be
Absolutely.
educating them on the dangers of stalking, and what is okay and isn't okay on social media.
What should someone do if they suspect something like stalking is taking place or is happening to them? What are the first steps, as it were?
So the first thing to do is notice it. So you need to notice the red flags in your relationship. I think the majority of stalking cases that involve ex-partners, there's been some kind of coercive or controlling behaviour, often from the beginning of the relationship. So you might want to look out for things like early declarations of love, possessiveness, jealousy. Jealousy is a major red flag, and often it just builds on what Kate was saying, things are happening very quickly in the beginning of the relationship. The victim and the perpetrator may move in together within a few weeks or months. The victim might get pregnant quite early. And things will start to escalate at some point. The relationship is usually dominated by coercive control. There might be physical abuse, but not always. I think recent research demonstrates that actually in stalking cases, violence isn't the biggest indicator of whether stalking will go on to homicide, for example. It's the controlling behaviour that's the biggest indicator. Jane Monckton Smith she's come up with a piece of research called the Homicide Timeline, which is really useful for everyone, victims, practitioners, and the wider public, to be aware of, to look out for whether stalking is going to become really, really dangerous. And she says you need to look at all those things in the early relationship that I've just mentioned, but also, has the perpetrator got a criminal record? You know, that's why Clare's Law is so important. If you've started a new relationship with someone and you're spotting any red flags, it would be a really good idea to apply for disclosure under Clare's Law, which you can do. You can do it on the internet. It's really easy. So whatever county you live in, so for us, we're in Hampshire, I would Google Clare's Law Hampshire, and the first thing that comes up will be a form, and you can fill it in online. It's really easy. You just follow the instructions and you put your details in, you put your partner's details in, and you ask for disclosure. So if you're in a new relationship and you're a bit worried, the police can then disclose to you whether there's anything that you need to know about your partner. Has there been any violence against women or girls in their past that you should be aware of? They're not going to tell you everything, so that person might have a criminal history for something else that's nothing to do with violence against women and girls, or any kind of violence against a partner. So they won't tell you everything, but they will tell you something if they think that actually you need to be aware of this so you can make an informed choice about that relationship. So yeah, you're looking at that pre-relationship history. Sometimes I've found with some of the clients I've worked with, they're often aware of reports, but they don't want to believe it, and their perpetrator has told them a story that paints themselves as the victim. So that's something that, you know, if I'm working with a client, we might need to unpick a bit further just to see if there is anything else going on there. So going on with the homicide timeline, so you're looking at your early relationship, but then within within the main relationship, it's dominated by coercive control, and you need to look for triggers. So there may be an event which threatens the control of the perpetrator. This is often, the threat of separation or its potential. And at that point, this is when abuse and potentially stalking could escalate. So then you have the escalation. There may be an increase in the control tactics used by a perpetrator. So, I mean, it could come in many different forms. The perpetrator may threaten suicide. They may, beg forgiveness. There may be violence. And there may be stalking. And so there'll be all sorts of attempts. They're just a few, but it comes in many different forms. But these are attempts that are made by the perpetrator to try and reinstate control over the situation. So at this stage, which on the homicide timeline is stage 5, in most relationships, this is where it ends. Stage 5, which is the escalation, this is where there may be some sort of incident or where the perpetrator is trying to control the situation in some form, like manipulate the situation, maybe say they're going to commit suicide, beg the victim to forgive them. There may be some violence. There may be some sort of stalking, either in person or digital. So these attempts are made by the perpetrator to reinstate control. And at this point, in most abusive relationships, things don't escalate from there. That's usually as bad as it gets. I mean, it can be pretty bad. There could have been a serious violent assault, but it doesn't normally go on from that point. But there are some relationships that are really dangerous, and this is why stalking is so dangerous, because it's very much related to homicide. And this is where, if it goes on, the perpetrator changes their thinking. They may have feelings of revenge. They may feel a sense of entitlement, as Kate said earlier, injustice. They may be humiliated, and this may drive them to try and change the situation. And this is potentially where they're thinking, okay, I might decide to kill my victim. So that's really dangerous. And then if it moves on to the next stage, that's the planning stage. And this is where the perpetrator may be thinking about how are they going to kill their victim. Are they buying weapons? Are they seeking opportunities to get the victim alone? Are they stalking them? How are they stalking them? What does that look like? Are they making threats? Have they been violent? In Alice Ruggles' case, he was turning up outside her flat, climbing over the back wall and into her garden and taking photographs, and often just turning up outside the flat. We had one case I worked on a few years ago where the perpetrator was turning up outside the victim's house and he had a big knife in the passenger seat. But luckily he was arrested at that point. So yeah, you've got the planning, they're thinking about how are they going to do it, and then the final stage is homicide. And that may involve extreme violence, suicide, suspicious death, missing persons reports. There may be multiple victims, including children. So that's why stalking is so dangerous. It is very much related to homicide, and I think that's only become really prevalent in recent years.
And what have the police attitudes changed? Because obviously we mentioned Alice and how that was an absolute failure. I was going to go to UK because obviously you drive around with these guys in the car, and is it changing? Is it getting there? Is it in the right direction?
I can't speak for the police in general, of course, and I wouldn't want to, but I will. On what I have seen, I can say that there are officers who absolutely recognise it for the choice of behaviour that it is, because I think a lot of time, like Steph said, most of the stalking is ex-partner relationships. And I think too often with the police and all of us in general, there's a tendency to scrutinise the behaviour of the victim. You know, did you lead them on? Why haven't you blocked them? The onus is on you to change your behaviour when you're being stalked. Move somewhere else, delete your social media, block them. You know, and whereas actually stalkers decide to engage in this behaviour. They make a series of choices that result in harm to their victim. And some of the police, I think, are really recognising that quite strongly. And they very much make the perpetrator the focus of any intervention that happens. And interventions obviously have to get to the root of the behaviour. But there are, and I have heard many a comment, and one unfortunately was from even a young female officer, and she said, well, I don't understand why she just doesn't block him. And I had one very recently, and this had been, we're at the point I had to find this woman a refuge with her young baby. That's quite desperate. And the policeman said to me, what I don't understand is if there's all this historical abuse, I don't understand why she's still with him. Why hasn't she left him? And then you engage in a conversation of, because there are many reasons why she might have been scared. She's been pregnant, clearly, and had a young baby. Finances are very difficult to leave if you've just had a baby. You might be dependent on that person. There are a stream of reasons. So even though I think the police most certainly are getting better trained, I think having advocates in the police stations to challenge those things as they're said and have those conversations immediately in the moment that you're in are really helpful. And I think, and of course there's been changes in the law, and some of these, like Alice's case, have been so highlighted. I do think it's going in the right direction. Absolutely, I do.
You mentioned something that I'd love to get both of your inputs on, and that is the whole idea of the blocking. Because I've heard two sides to the argument. I've heard the one side, of course, that you should block the person immediately because it stops them from engaging with you. But then I've also heard from the other side that you shouldn't block because it allows you to gather evidence or something.
I think the main thing for victims is how are they managing their safety. And if you block someone, you've blocked a channel of communication which could be safer. It could be safer for you to have your perpetrator call you or text you or send you a message on social media. If you block all of those avenues or you don't manage it through that, are they then going to be turning up at your house or your place of work? And what's safer from your point of view? So I think we shouldn't give blanket advice. You need to block them. You need to think about, okay, what would the consequences be if you did block them? What would that look like?
Okay, interesting. As you said, it sounds like it isn't a one, size fits all kind of situation.
No way.
No, and in those circumstances, and this is something I would really say to the police, is when you're dealing with cases of stalking behaviour, the main thing I would say is listen to your victim. Victims know their stalkers better than anyone else. They are familiar with their patterns of behaviour, their tactics, their moods. They are the best people to assess the level of danger that they are in. So if a victim says they feel the behaviour has escalated and they're afraid, it's because the behaviour has escalated and there is a reason to be afraid. So there's, as like Steph says, there's not a blanket. Listen to your victim, listen to what they're saying to you. They know them better than anyone else. And from there, then you can offer support and advice. And again, it's like I was saying earlier about what are your boundaries? When is enough for you? Alice made hers clear, and that made him worse. But of course, what else could she do? That was, all the onus on that was on him. There was nothing she could have done. He was that person. So I think listen to your victim, because you're talking about human behaviour, and every single one of us is different, be you victim or perpetrator, we're all different. Listen to your victim. They know.
And what can someone do? I mean, as this podcast stands, we're doing this because we want to raise awareness. You mentioned earlier, Steph, that, of course, you need to see that it's happening in the first place. So if you've established it is happening, what things out there, what services out there can someone then call upon?
I think talk to people to start with, but talk to professionals and talk to people who understand stalking. Because it's all very well going to your parents or your friends, but they may not understand stalking. And I think Alice Ruggles' families, they've spoken quite freely about it, that they didn't really understand the dangers. They just said, oh, it's a phase, he'll leave you alone soon enough. But he didn't, did he? So I think definitely talk to professionals, get in touch with your local domestic abuse service. If you haven't got one, you can go to your local council and find out who you can get advice from.
Well, thank you very much. I thought that was a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much, Stephanie.
Thank you.